So good evening and welcome to the final MyCP webinar series for 2021. I'm your host. My name is Paul Gross, and I'm very excited to have Dr. Bhooma Aravamuthan talk to us tonight about an update on a lot of activity that we've got going on in and around the CP Research Network on dystonia in CP, which is an area she's really focused a lot of time on and has great depth of knowledge. So I'm going to do my usual introduction to the CP Research Network and then turn the presentation over to Dr. Bhooma, and then we'll have an open Q&A and we'll close with our social time. Okay, so CPRN, as it originally went by most commonly internally, was founded out of an NIH workshop on CP called State of the Science and Treatment in CP that NIH put on in November 2014. And there was something quite unique about that meeting, because at the end of the meeting, the organizers stood at the front of the room and assigned to members of the attendees each of the 5 top priorities that came out of that. And I was fortunate enough to be in a task force with Deb Gabler to look at starting a national CP registry. And out of that dialogue came the discussion to not only create a registry, but to surround it with a clinical research network. And over the next 2 or 3 months following that meeting, we ended up taking on the first 4 of those priorities to start a national CP registry, to do more comparative effectiveness research of all of these interventions, to increase the study of adults, and then bring more young clinician researchers into the field. At the time, we were staying away from advancing basic and translational science, but early in the network's founding, we connected with Dr. Michael Kruer, and that sort of expanded us into this translational realm with his work in genetics. So the network is really a merging of 2 core experiences that were sort of discovered at that early stage. I have a 16-year-old son with both cerebral palsy and hydrocephalus, and I had started 2 clinical research networks around hydrocephalus. So I had experience doing that. And then Dr. Gary Noritz from Nationwide Children's had this experience of doing a single center registry at Nationwide, where all of the data was collected directly into the electronic medical record through standard care. And that was a very big change and an aha for me in what became CPRN. So we've been patient-centered from the very outset, with me being the father of a boy with CP, and with me partnering from the very beginning with Michelle Schusterman, who in that next year, 2015, when CPRN was founded a nonprofit called CP Now. So some of the key milestones for CPRN were we did launch that clinical registry in March of 2016, and now it's got over 5,000 patients in it. The registry elements, the data definition that makes up the registry was taken by Epic, who's the leading maker of electronic medical record systems. So most hospitals have our database, our registry built in. It's just a matter of getting the forms up and running, which is not a small task, as Dr. Bhooma can attest. And we have 18 sites that are currently either collecting data on a subset of their CP population or their whole CP population, depending on the site and their capabilities. So I said we were patient-centered from the outset, and one of the first things we did was we partnered with CP Now to create a patient-centered research agenda. We went off and got funding from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and we ran a year-long process to create an agenda, which was published in 2018 and serves as the sort of guiding light for what we think is important to do. We've had some significant public funding milestones for our registry, including support to expand it to look explicitly at the crossover between cerebral palsy and epilepsy, and then a big NIH grant funded through University of Arizona, through Michael Kruer's genetics study, which was funded in 2019 and was launched to recruit people in 2021. We have not only the clinical registry, i.e. one in where data is collected when someone goes to the hospital, but we have a patient-powered registry, which we call the Community Registry, because it's intended to collect data about your lived experience in the community. We have over 1,000 participants in that from the community already, roughly equally split between people with CP and caregivers of people with CP. And we're also running a study in that patient-powered registry that is a study of adults. And to the discussion that was happening before we got going on the webinar, it's really intended to look at a cross-section of the population of adults and follow them over time. We have over 240 adults registered in that. If you're an adult with CP and you haven't participated, it's free, takes about 20 to 30 minutes. It would be hugely valuable, and I would encourage you to do that. And I'll talk about how to do that in a moment. We have 4 quality improvement initiatives that we launched across the network, which are another way to achieve outcomes beyond research that sort of change the systems of care. We're going to hear a bit about one of those tonight. And we've had 4 publications to date. We've had over 20 academic presentations, and we have more than 8 manuscripts under development right now to sort of publish the work of that we've been doing over the last 6 years. So I mentioned CP Now, and that's very critical for those of you who haven't followed us closely. They launched in 2015 with the launch of the Cerebral Palsy Toolkit, which is really this guide for people that get a new diagnosis of CP. And Michelle, who created that 501c3 and led the effort to make that toolkit, received a big award from AACPDM in 2016 for that work. We worked together, as I said, on Research CP, and then she followed up with a well-being guide as a resource, still for the parents, but for the parents to focus on the care they need to take of themselves in dealing with a child that has medical complexity, and what are the strains that causes on the parents and how to self-care. The toolkit was then released in Spanish in 2017 and Portuguese in 2019. And then CP Now went on to do another one of its pillars, which was to fund research. And in 2020, that $25,000 funded a research CP grant that we ran through the CP Research Network. And then in addition, CP Now was working to seed wellness programs, contributing in many different areas in that regard. In 2021, the beginning of this year, we merged CP Now and CPRN to form the Cerebral Palsy Research Network, which we try to call the CP Research Network now. I sometimes slip into calling it CPRN because it's 6 years of training. And it really was brought together these 4 sites that were resources for either the community or clinicians and researchers under one umbrella. The mission under that umbrella is optimizing the lifelong health and wellness of people with cerebral palsy and their families through high quality research, education, and involvement in community programming. So the network is a 501c3 now. It's really these groups of people in the extended CP community, including the institutions and clinicians that treat people with CP, along with people with CP and advocates coming together to try to improve outcomes. Physically, we have a data coordinating center at the University of Utah, and that means that's where the data for the registry, which is just information about people and treatments and whatnot, comes together there. And they host both our clinical and our community registry. And then we have 2 big other programs beyond the network, which is the education program that produces our website and toolkits, and our well-being programs. We focus a lot on engagement of the, we focus a lot on engagement of the community through MyCP. MyCP is a web portal that you sign into, and it gives you access to participate in the surveys if you're a member of the if you are a person with CP or the parent or caregiver of a person with CP. But there's also discussions about research. People will very often post a question and say, is this the right thing to do or whatnot? And I will tag like Dr. Bhooma or Dr. Kruer or Dr. Noritz and have them weigh in and say, what's the evidence base? They're not giving medical advice, but they're pointing at what is the evidence base for these different interventions. We also provide personalized resources on MyCP that are specifically about you and your your CP. And that's also how we provide access to our free fitness programs, which are part of our wellness offering. Anybody can sign up at mycp.org. And I would encourage you, if you haven't signed up, to do that. Okay, so just a few other things to give you context. So this is one data point from our clinical registry from last year when we had about 4,000 people. And this is just showing you the gross motor function classification scale rating or level for the people in that are in the registry. And so you can see, people that are 1 through 3 can ambulate independently, 4s and 5s, use a wheelchair, and you can see the distribution of people. And that is just one example of, I think we have somewhere on the order of 1,200 data points that up to 1,200 data points that we collect in a clinical setting. Whereas the community registry really supports these discussions and also has surveys that can be done to both caregivers and people with CP. And we've been using that to do both that adult study. Dr. Bhooma's run a study through there. She's got another one queued up about sensory. I'll let you describe it when you get it. I'm going to use the wrong words to describe it when I get there. But anyway, so those are the 2 core tools that we have. And those make up the programs of the CP Research Network. So that photo in the top left is when we had 45 people together in Chicago for what was a marvelous event of both members of the community and clinicians and therapists really talking about what was important in research. And then our last face-to-face research meeting in Michigan over there on the right. And then our resources that we have to offer and our well-being programs. So the network is spread across North America. The green dots represent sites that are currently collecting data. The yellow dots are somewhere in the sort of technology process. The red dots are still doing a little bit of their compliance work to get data sharing agreements in place. And the blue dots are sites that have raised their hand and said, we're interested in joining the network at some point in the future and are sort of starting to evaluate that. You can get all the exact details about where we are right on our website on cprn.org. So the last thing before I turn it over to Dr. Bhooma is this is our research pipeline. I was recently looking at this over time, and I think I might start to use this as a build to sort of display the kind of progress that we have made. The whole idea of the network is to facilitate research, make it so that people who have ideas can find people to collaborate with, have enough patients to contribute meaningful data to a study so things can be powered well enough. And the wide end of the funnel is where we have concepts that we review, and then we go and try and get funding for, and then we implement, and then we publish, and then we roll the evidence base back into the practice through the way that we collect data in the registry. The orange ovals are our quality improvement efforts, and the green ovals are our research efforts. And tonight we're going to kind of span the gamut. And you can see the ones that are highlighted with a little green highlight are the 3 about dystonia, and Dr. Bhooma will touch on those. So I skipped ahead, sorry. Dr. Aravamuthan is an assistant professor of neurology at Washington University School of Medicine. She is a pediatric neurologist with a specialty in movement disorders at St. Louis Children's. She runs her own lab. I don't know if she's going to talk about that at all tonight. And she's a leader in the network, really has been very involved in our 2 big, both research and quality improvement efforts in the network, and she's leading our QI effort. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Bhooma.
Thanks, Paul.
No worries.
Okay, am I good on the slide view?
You're all good.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm really excited to talk about this today. This is one of my, if not my most favorite topic, is talking about dystonia and CP. I think it's incredibly important to discuss, and I'm so glad to be talking about it today in the context of what we've been doing within the Cerebral Palsy Research Network. I have no relevant disclosures. So what I'm going to be talking about just going to break it down into three parts. A quick overview of what is dystonia and CP and why should we all care. Then I'll talk about our two big CP Research Network dystonia initiatives. One is Research CP Dystonia Edition, building off the Research CP initiative that Paul described just a few minutes ago. And the second is where we stand currently in our dystonia QI efforts, so the dystonia quality improvement group and what we're doing there. And then I'll talk about next steps, and what we're focusing on for next steps really derive from the community-driven research agenda that we set with Research CP Dystonia Edition. So I'm really proud that our next steps are really focusing on what we all want as a team and not just what individual investigators think would be interesting to look at. So I think this is a really great approach that the CP Research Network is advocating for. So first, what is dystonia? Dystonia we generally think of as falling under a group of motor symptoms called hypertonia or high tone. The other forms of high tone are spasticity and rigidity. I'm not going to talk about rigidity so much because that form of high tone is rarely seen in CP, in true CP. But I will talk about spasticity and dystonia, which are very common in CP, and I'll get to numbers in a little bit. Spasticity and dystonia can be differentiated in a couple of ways, and I have these bullet points written here like it's super easy to do that, but it's not. This is just kind of the overview of how we differentiate them. And one of the big gaps that the community highlighted is that we need better ways to differentiate dystonia from spasticity. So spasticity is a type of tone, a type of high tone that's present all the time. So when you're awake, when you're asleep, when you're sick, when you're excited, when you're calm, it's the kind of high tone that just kind of sticks with you. It's not triggered by voluntary movement. So you can have some variability to that degree of high tone, but it tends to not be triggered and not be too variable over the course of the day. Dystonia, on the other hand, is really variable. It tends to be absent during sleep. So you might find that you have some parts of your high tone that stick around when you're asleep, and some parts of your high tone or unintentional movements that you have during the day, but when you're asleep, those unintentional movements go away. Those unintentional movements could possibly be movements that are consistent with dystonia. Dystonia, by definition, is triggered by voluntary movement. So that means that when you try to move a part of your body, other muscles that you don't intend to move without you meaning to. Just that concept, parts of your body move without you meaning to, the functional implications, I think, of that are clear. How that sort of loss of control, particularly when you're trying to make a movement, how that can be deeply functionally limiting. The formal definition is here, this sustained or intermittent muscle contractions causing abnormal, often repetitive movements, postures, or both, initiated or worsened by voluntary action associated with overflow muscle activation. So that's quite a mouthful, and it's also very broad, but overall, the main findings here are, or the main features here are what we talked about before. So the intermittent aspect, that it can be variable, that it involves muscles contracting, so muscles moving when you don't want them to. It's initiated by attempts to move, and this concept of overflow muscle activation. So it's not just the muscle that you're trying to move, it's muscles that you're not trying to move in other parts of your body that start moving. And the magnitude of dystonia, so how much dystonia you have, how severe it is, can vary with arousal, meaning that it tends to be worse when you're awake compared to when you're asleep. It can be triggered by excitement. It can be triggered by stress. Those sorts of arousal or emotional status triggers can be associated with dystonia also. When we think about how we classify different types of CP, this is kind of the standard classification that most people think of, this SCPE classification, Surveillance of Cerebral Palsy in Europe, that was set out quite some time ago at this point in 2000. The key features that they lay out for deciding if someone has dystonia predominant CP, which is the main component of so-called dyskinetic CP, or spasticity predominant CP, is there persistently high tone, so do you have high tone, and is the tone varying? And that tends to be kind of that break point between, are you going to say if this person with variable tone, if they do have variable tone, they're more likely to have dystonia predominant CP. If they don't have variable tone, they're more likely to have spasticity predominant CP. And based on this breakdown, it seems, or it looked like dystonia predominant CP was common, but in the significant minority compared to spasticity predominant CP. But what we're learning about more and more is that this may be a false dichotomy, that a lot of people with spasticity may have dystonia, and that often these types of tone overlap. And kind of who are we to say which is the most important form of tone for that given person and their function? Excellent research from Darcy Failing's group has shown that using a tool that they've developed called the hypertonia assessment tool has shown that almost all people with spasticity, up to 80%, have some degree of dystonia, and this is most commonly seen in the legs. So you see the overlapping of these Venn diagram circles here, that they're almost completely overlapped on top of each other. So thinking about dystonia, not just in the 15% of people where it is the most obvious or the predominant form of their tone, but thinking about it across the board for people with CP is important. Dystonia is not just common, it is often painful and functionally limiting. Most people with severe dystonia report that they have pain from their dystonia. Most people report that dystonia limits their function. And of people that have dystonia, the majority are at the highest limitation levels on gross motor function, manual function, and for speech. So this is really a high impact issue and a very common issue that we're targeting here. One of the biggest problems that we already know about dystonia is that it's hard to diagnose. So what we've shown recently is that, particularly in young children, not just dystonia, but all tone types go underdiagnosed. So this is in a group of kids who are at high risk for CP. And of those who ultimately did receive a CP diagnosis, only about 30% of those kids had their tone type specified by the time they were 5. So that means that increasing practitioner awareness of tone type and of the value of identifying dystonia early, which is mainly for treatment purposes, is really important. This is the just a quick snapshot of the hypertonia assessment tool that has really advanced our ability to codify or to really lay out what features we should be looking for as practitioners on exam to be able to say someone does or does not have dystonia. And it's done a great job of allowing us to clearly say, these are the forms of high tone, these are the features that are associated with these different forms of high tone. One of the problems that we still see though, even though tools like this are available, is that it still relies on practitioners being able to detect what might be really subtle changes on exam. And this is a quote from one of the papers describing the HAT, the hypertonia assessment tool. Involuntary movement postures can be subtle and often consist of finger or toe flexion or wrist flexion. So these are tiny movements you might see in the clinic. And often those clinic visits are 30 minutes, an hour if you're lucky, if it's a new patient visit. There's a lot of ground to cover. And our practitioners, particularly those who are focused on certain aspects of your care, really going to be able to recognize in that short visit whether you have these subtle motor findings or not. And moreover, if you're meeting a doctor for the first time in not your natural setting, right? I mean, it's a stressful situation to be able to get to a clinic, to be in that waiting room, to be there all day. You're tired, you're stressed, you're meeting someone you've never seen before or seeing very infrequently. And whether your tone status in that visit is truly representative of the tone status you have in your day-to-day life, I think we can all question that. And because dystonia is so variable and detecting that variability is a huge part of diagnosis, is the exam really the best way, the only way, that one-time exam to diagnose dystonia? And as I've laid this out, I hope you have intuited that the answer is no, that diagnosing dystonia can't just be a one-time exam thing. It has to be a longitudinal assessment process and a discussion with the person with CP and their families regarding what types of movements they're observing. So all of those issues, this difficulty in diagnosing dystonia, the huge impact it has on people with CP, and the importance in identifying treatments for dystonia and our limitation in finding those treatments made us lay out Research CP Dystonia Edition. And this is something we did over the last year and a half. The flow chart for how we did this is here. We created a series of educational webinars that are still available through the CP Research Network website and are on YouTube, talking about definitions of dystonia. So really building on what I have very briefly talked about earlier, existing care pathways, what we currently know about treatments, and the current state of the research for dystonia. And these were talks laid out by me, Darcy Failings, and Michael Kruer. We had quite a few people watch those webinars. And then we asked them, okay, now that you know the status quo, now that you know the state of the field, can you tell us what are things that you are still uncertain about that you wish the field would focus on answering? And we had 28 people generate those uncertainties. That was across people who had CP, caregivers, researchers, and clinicians. We then, as a steering group, vetted those ideas to make sure that they had not already been answered in the literature, and very few of those ideas met those criteria, meaning that the vast majority of uncertainties that were generated by the participants, we confirmed were true uncertainties, were not something that had already been addressed in the literature. And then through a really innovative platform set up through Paul, we had people vote in kind of this pairwise round robin format on which uncertainties they would prioritize. So people were given a pair with a pair of uncertainties serially and asked to choose which uncertainty they thought, if addressed, would lead to the greatest benefit for the cerebral palsy community. And then after that, we took those prioritizations. We looked at the top prioritizations, the top uncertainties, the top ranked uncertainties, and then consolidated them into themes. So areas that we think the field should focus on, because the community is saying this is what's most important to them in terms of addressing dystonia and CP. And I'll tell you, just participating in this process was illuminating, because it really highlighted the thirst in the community for answering questions about this topic, and also highlighted what great partners we can all be with each other in terms of addressing research in the field. And it really has shaped how I view my research career, honestly. So it's been a blessing to be involved in this process. These are the themes that we developed based on the top prioritized uncertainties, the themes that were consolidated from those top prioritized uncertainties. There were 10 themes. These are the first 5. And of these themes, I just want to highlight that 5 of them were generated from uncertainties that the community themselves suggested, meaning uncertainties suggested by people with CP or their caregivers. So that again means that of these themes, these may not have been themes that practitioners or that researchers would have thought of on their own. The first theme, develop new treatments. Well, okay, that seems very clear that that should be a top theme. But the second theme, which was also a community driven theme, assess rehabilitation and psychological management approaches. I have to say is a really clever one, because dystonia, as I mentioned before, can often be stress triggered, arousal triggered, as I mentioned. And thinking about how you can modify some of those triggers to help reduce dystonia in a way that is associated with decreased medication burden is a very clever approach. And honestly, something I'm starting to investigate in my lab as well, Paul mentioned my lab briefly. I have a mouse-based lab that looks at what causes dystonia after neonatal brain injury, so in cerebral palsy models. And this concept of stress as a trigger for dystonia has really become interesting to me, in part because of the prioritization of this theme in this community-driven research agenda. Another theme I want to highlight in this top 5 is improved diagnosis and severity assessments. I talked about the hypertonia assessment tool and how that's really helped revolutionize our detection of dystonia. But it's how do we improve the rates of dystonia diagnosis now that that tool exists? And how do we rate the severity of dystonia? Our severity assessments currently available often take quite a long time to employ. So using them in clinical practice is not necessarily feasible. If you have a severity assessment that takes 30 minutes to do and you have a 30-minute clinic visit, the chances that practitioners are going to do it decreases. So that's another key theme that showed up in this top 5. These are the last of the top 10 themes. I want to highlight a couple of these themes in particular. One is describe the natural history. So this goes back to what we were discussing earlier, that cerebral palsy is a lifelong condition. By definition, it's a permanent condition. That's the wording in the consensus definition. So it is really valuable for us to understand not just when dystonia starts or the average age of dystonia starting in childhood, but what happens through adulthood. What are rates of dystonia in adulthood? Do people who are adults who did not really experience functional limitations from their dystonia in childhood develop functionally limiting dystonia in adulthood? And there are anecdotal reports of that, but we need better assessments of the overall natural history of dystonia across the lifespan in people with CP. The other theme I want to highlight is increased family awareness. And as shameful as it may be to say, this may not have been a theme that clinicians and researchers came up with on their own. And it was a community-generated theme. The uncertainty that contributed to it was from a person with CP or their caregiver. And it is ridiculously important to think about family awareness. It should be a top priority, because how are we as practitioners who may not see dystonia in a certain clinic visit going to know to bring it up if it only happens or it's only clearly visible outside of those clinic visits? So making families aware, making people with CP aware, letting them know that if they're observing dystonia at home, and if it's functionally limiting, that's something they should discuss with their practitioner. So important. And I'm glad that it rose to the cream of these themes that emerged from the research agenda we set. We discussed these themes as a part of the CPRN annual meeting last year. And we realized that really to address many of these themes, focusing on treatment, focusing on predictors of treatment response, talking about treatments for pain and dystonia with CP, that we really needed to start with being able to diagnose dystonia in CP. If you can't identify it, you can't treat it. So we really recognize the primacy of theme 4, improved diagnosis and severity assessments. And we also recognize the primacy of theme 10, increased family awareness, for the reasons I described to you. So as we move forward with our QI initiatives, and as I talk to you a little bit about my own research in this regard, I'll talk about it primarily in the context of themes 4 and 10. So first, improving diagnosis. Our QI initiative recognized, again, very early that theme 4 should be our first focus. And when we think about quality improvement, we're thinking about how are we currently doing with regards to a goal, and what is an intervention that we can all implement to help us reach a set goal. So our first question for ourselves as CPRN investigators were, how well are we documenting features of dystonia when we see a person with CP in our clinic? And We're all obviously interested in this topic. This is a subgroup of investigators that chose to be a part of a dystonia QI initiative, of a quality improvement initiative. So you'd like to think we'd be pretty good at it, but we could do a lot better. So, and this is a common theme that we see across a lot of QI initiatives, that we tend to think that because we're so interested in a certain topic, that we're already doing a great job. And we still have a lot of room for improvement even amongst ourselves. So identifying how we can improve is really the first step to telling other people how they can improve. So what we did was in order to assess how well we were doing this, we selected key features of dystonia that we thought should be documented in every new visit with a person with CP. So first, this is pretty straightforward, is whether or not they have dystonia. And although this seems simple, what we recognized is if we often don't document the absence of something, we often document the presence of something. And that's fine, but if you're not documenting that you don't see something, it on subsequent visits kind of leaves your mind, if that makes sense. So it kind of highlights the importance of thinking about dystonia in a concrete way every time you see a person with CP in clinic. So that was a key feature that we wanted documented. Another is whether or not they had variable tone on history. So this we thought was key, actually talking to the person with CP and their family about what they saw outside of the clinic room. Next was to document whether or not they had spasticity. And the reason we wanted to do that was because if you have high tone, but on exam you don't have spasticity, or you have minimal spasticity, chances are that high tone is actually dystonia and not spasticity, as everyone would kind of jump to the conclusion of, because the thought is that that is the predominant form of tone in CP. And then lastly on exam was to look for one of the key features of the hat. Do you have voluntary movement triggered increased tone or postures? Yep, and all of these were based on key features of the hat. So what we found, somewhat shockingly, is that we're documenting this information about 40% of the time. And this is a group of investigators that really care about this issue. So again, highlighting how much space we have to improve. And one might ask, why are we focused on notes? Like, what is the value of documentation? As I mentioned before, actually saying the word dystonia, seeing it in your note is a reminder to the practitioner that it's something important to be screened for, out of sight, out of mind. So as you pull your template in to each note, which is how medical notes are written these days, just seeing the word dystonia as a trigger to you to say, okay, well, even though I didn't think this person had dystonia last time, maybe this time I should still assess and see whether they have dystonia in this visit. And the second is family awareness. So more and more now, people are having access to the notes that practitioners write. And even if in the clinic visit, there was not time to discuss this particular aspect of the exam or this particular aspect of a practitioner's assessment of you or of your child with CP, the fact that you can go back and read the note and see that there was something called dystonia mentioned and that you don't have it, or that you do, is a trigger for the family to say, okay, well, I don't really know much about this. Maybe the next visit I can make a point to ask about it. So the value of documentation there is twofold, both for the practitioner and for the family. What we're working on now as a next step, now that we have this baseline information, is to implement a standardized documentation approach for dystonia in people with CP. And that's something we're working on launching in just a few weeks. So what I want to talk about now is what it means, what the status quo is for dystonia diagnosis, and research efforts that I'm involved in to improve this, to go to the next steps for this. So the current status quo is expert consensus, and that's a group of people, group of practitioners with dystonia expertise discussing a person's exam, either seeing them in person or discussing a video of that exam. The problem with this is there aren't groups of these experts scattered all across the country. So what about areas without direct access to these experts? How do we give them access to dystonia diagnosis? So we thought about dystonia diagnosis in a new way. We wanted to first analyze the discussions experts have about dystonia and figure out what is it they're specifically saying when they diagnose dystonia, not just, oh, you have involuntary movements triggered by voluntary movement, but what are the specific movements? What are you seeing that makes you say someone has dystonia? And the idea for doing this was, if we can give people more specificity in what to look for, it might be that much easier for another practitioner to be able to diagnose dystonia, not just have to rely on a group of select experts to diagnose it. Then the next thing we did was look at the videos that these experts analyzed, or look at a comparable set of videos that you record, that many of us have recorded in clinic with just a smartphone, and then see if we could analyze limb positioning in these videos to come up with a quantitative way to describe these specific expert-cited features. So one, can we determine what these features are by analyzing what experts say? And two, can we come up with a way to calculate a value, a numerical value for those features, with the ultimate aim of saying, if we can calculate a numerical value, would that track with dystonia severity? So focusing on that theme for improving diagnosis and severity assessments. What we found, the first thing is something we already know. So the dystonia is hard to diagnose. Across the videos that we had experts analyze, even after consensus building discussion, you'll see this gray box, about 15% of the time, experts could not reach consensus on whether or not a person with CP in that short video snippet had dystonia. And that doesn't, I don't want you to leave this thinking that that means that experts can't diagnose dystonia. What it means is that it's not a one-stop shop. So just one snippet, one exam maneuver, these were all of people with CP walking in a straight line. That's not enough. Dystonia assessment has to be more comprehensive, has to involve perhaps repeated assessment, and should also involve a discussion with the family and with the person with CP. These are a couple of example videos that we assessed. On the left is a person that has spastic CP, spasticity, but did not have dystonia. And on the right is a young girl who had both spasticity and dystonia. And you can see the differences in the way they're walking, that the person on the right had much more variability in how she was moving her legs in and out. You see that variable scissoring, variable crossing of the legs as she moves through the hallway. And what we did was use quantitative techniques to label parts of the body in these videos and calculate features that we thought best correlated with how experts describe dystonia. And we found that we could quantify those features, and using those numerical values alone, we could line up with how experts identify dystonia about 93% of the time, which is great. I mean, it's not 100%, but think about being able to share this information in areas where you may not have access to movement disorders experts. And you could use this as kind of a screening tool to say, okay, well, we think this person might have dystonia. Maybe we should refer them somewhere where that assessment can be done in person and in detail to confirm that they have dystonia and think about the treatment, the right treatment regimen for them. When we assessed what it was that experts were saying, they found that when they saw dystonia, that it was in one limb at any given time, that it was variable over time, and that it involved adduction, so moving a leg in or a foot in, typically during gait. And you saw that in the video I described earlier. And those were the specific variables that we quantified in each of these graphs, variables that corresponded to each of these features, and saw that those numbers were elevated in videos where people displayed dystonia. We started looking at whether any of these variables tracked with expert assessments of dystonia severity. And we found that the degree of variability did. So there was a significant correlation, you can see this line is an upslope, between severity ratings, that's here down on the x-axis, so higher scores or higher severity, and the amount of variability. So that's here on the y-axis, higher scores or high variability. So the more variability in how much your leg moved in or out, the higher severity score. And this was a very specific feature to variability. So overall, how much you moved your leg in didn't really make a difference. And I also want to point out that this was specific to CP. And I make that point because dystonia in large part has been studied not in people with CP, which is crazy to me because CP is the most common cause of dystonia in childhood and one of the most common causes of dystonia in adulthood. So it's really important to study this in CP. And I make that point because if we study these same variables in a different cause of dystonia, and this is a genetic cause of dystonia called DYT1, we see a different relationship. It's not variability that tracks with severity. So it's not this first graph. It's the second graph that tracks with severity, the median leg adduction. And that's the opposite thing that we saw in people with CP. And I want to show you these videos just to highlight why it's important to think about dystonia specifically in CP. So you might see that the patterns of gait here, the patterns of walking, are really quite a bit different between this young man with DYT1 associated dystonia on the left and this young lady with CP associated dystonia on the right. Just the how variable their gait is, how wide their gait base is, their walking base is, very different. So thinking about this specifically in the context of CP and not trying to extrapolate or generalize from other causes of dystonia is really important. As I close off, I also want to talk about efforts to increase family awareness. And a large part of my focus on this stemmed from Research CP Dystonia Edition. I talked to you about what are the expert-cited features of dystonia and our work to characterize that. But what I really mean is what are the practitioner-cited features of dystonia, right? Because we're not the only experts, you are. People with CP and people that see it every day, their caregivers are experts on dystonia because you see it not just in those short clinic visits, you see it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So when we talk about dystonia and who the experts are, we shouldn't just be talking about us. We should be talking about how you describe your own dystonia. And that's important because if we're trying to take a history and ask, do you have dystonia or not? We need to know how you view your own dystonia to be able to ask those questions properly. And we're starting to do that at our center, and we're starting to expand this to other centers, looking at community voices, our patient voices, their caregiver voices, people with CP and their voices about how they describe their own dystonia. And I'll tell you at the beginning, I talked about dystonia as high tone, as a form of high tone. And we do think of it that way. A lot of practitioners think about it that way. But what we found is that people with CP don't necessarily think about it that way. Often, people with CP describe their dystonia as unintentional movements, not increased tone, not tensing, which they tend to reserve more for describing spasticity, but more unintentional movements that are triggered by other things. So this question, when you try to move one part of your body, do you move another part of your body without meaning to? And this is an example. When you're picking up an object with one hand, does your other hand start moving? And then this question, during activities where someone handles a part of your body, do you move a different part of your body without meaning to? So during PT, when someone is stretching your legs, are your arms extending? And really asking people with CP and their family members to describe their answers to these questions has been illuminating. Yes, answers to these questions have very high specificity for dystonia when answered by caregivers or people with CP, meaning if you answer yes to both of these questions, there is a very high likelihood that you have dystonia associated with your CP. And what we did was we asked these questions of people in an open-ended fashion and asked them to describe what they saw. And some of the examples were really great. So for example, during transfers, do you have back arching? That seemed to be an important and a commonly cited feature that was seen particularly for young children with CP and dystonia. So what we're doing now is consolidating all of your quotes, so quotes from people with CP and their caregivers, into a survey that we're hoping to optimize so we can understand how you describe your own dystonia, how people with the CP describe their own dystonia. And we're really hoping this increases awareness for families, but we're also hoping this increases awareness for us and could be used as clinic screeners. So to overview what we've talked about, we talked about what is dystonia and CP and why we should all care. To the CPRN dystonia initiatives, and I again want to thank Paul for the importance of Research CP Dystonia Edition, which has, without hyperbole, changed how I approach this topic overall. And then next steps that I'm pursuing in the lab. And I'll talk about that a little bit in, just to expand on that a little bit, practitioner awareness focused on the Dystonia QI initiative that I talked about, hopefully building out a video registry within CPRN that Paul and I are just in the beginnings of working on with multiple other CPRN investigators to expand on some of the work I already described. And then thinking about family awareness, both through how we can leverage MyCP, which Paul described earlier, and other educational materials and offerings that we can do, like this webinar setup that we've set up. So with that, I'm happy to take questions and acknowledge this incredible team that was the driving force of everything I've talked about today. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Bhooma. Let me, let's open it up to questions. You know, I want to be respectful of the hour, but let's see. Can you stop your share too, if you would?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yep.
So we can have people's screens. Does anybody have any questions? You can either speak, raise your hand. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Hi, thank you so much for all of your great work and for the whole organization for putting effort into this. We have a son who is 16 with CP and he has dystonia. It's pretty intense, and he really has been struggling for a while, and we're trying to figure out how to support him. And I know this presentation was really about you know, the current research, and I'm looking for, like, we have an appointment with his neurologist next week, and I want to be able to go and say, what about these things? So, like, what's your top support for people with the treatment for people with dystonia, because he's really uncomfortable.
Yeah, let me, I'm going to answer that question and then put a link in the chat, or maybe send it to Paul for him to post through MyCP. There was an excellent review that came out just this past year on rating of different treatments for dystonia and CP. And I'll talk about that kind of generally in terms of options. So first line, the first thing we typically assess is whether the functionally limiting dystonia that someone has, well, first, is it functionally limiting? Does it need treatment? Obviously, in your case, it does, it sounds like. Second, is that focal or generalized? So is it affecting one part of the person's body, or is it affecting their whole body? And if it's one part, we tend to go more the botulinum toxin route. If it's the whole body, we think about some medications that overlap with spasticity, for spasticity treatment first, like Baclofen, medications like clobazam or other medications in that class that help kind of generally loosen all types of tone. For dystonia in particular, Clonidine and Gabapentin, there is a lot of good evidence for both, or more evidence for those than there is for other medications. In my practice, I tend to use Clonidine for people that have dystonia and a lot of mood issues, or dystonia and a lot of sleep issues. Clonidine can double cover those things. For people that have dystonia that's very painful or pain-triggered dystonia, Gabapentin, I tend to go more on the Gabapentin side of things. I also think that for a lot of people, particularly older kids that have worsening of dystonia as they age, anxiety can be a big trigger for dystonia. So I know, for example, one of my kids, whenever they go to a restaurant, their dystonia just kind of acts up, and just because it's an anxiety provoking situation for them, and they would love to be able to go out and eat at a restaurant with their family, but that part of it's really tough. So in situations like that, anxiety treatments can be really helpful too. Not to necessarily treat anxiety, although that could be a happy coincident thing, but to also treat dystonia. And then if we're talking about non-medication options, there are other medication options, but those tend to be my first go-tos, and the clonidine, gabapentin, baclofen, benzodiazepines tend to be the group of medications that are the most, that we have the most evidence for, and are likely going to be top on the list in the updated AAC-PDM care pathway. Paul has linked to the last one, but that's in the process of getting updated. Surgical treatments are another option. Those are not offered at all centers. Options include intrathecal baclofen. Not
have
where
that.
you have that. Okay. So, so there are two general locations you can do it. One is in the low spine and the other is in the high spine. And there are centers that do high spine intrathecal baclofen for dystonia, with the idea that to treat dystonia, you really need baclofen to be infusing into the brain, not necessarily down into the spine. So that's one. And the other thing that's emerging is deep brain stimulation for dystonia.
Yeah.
And that is offered at some centers. The patient selection process for that is very specific, and that would be a lecture in and of itself, but I think everybody should be aware of it as an option. And I think if you've kind of exhausted your medical options, your medication options, it should be something that's discussed. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but
No, that was super helpful. And can I ask a follow-up question?
Stephanie, can I open it to other people, because we're at the hour mark, and then if we have time, we'll come back, because I want to make sure if there are other questions that are based on Bhooma's presentation, that we get those answered. Go ahead, Anne. You're muted, Anne.
I want to say thank you first for putting on this, because I have an 18-year-old grandson that has dystonia in CP, and it has educated me beyond my wildest dreams to understand better, you know, what Jake deals with on a daily basis. And by the way, he was the one that told me about this webinar tonight, and he is very active in trying to understand and make things better for himself. I applaud him. He is a very bright young man. And the thing that really touched me is about family awareness. Having seen this lecture, I am overjoyed that I know more, and I always have felt the more we understand, the easier it is to understand what another person deals with. So I'll keep it short and let somebody else talk, but thank you so much.
thank you for those kind words. Thanks to Jake also.
I recognize your name, your name from the whole Research CP Dystonia edition. Are there any other questions? Okay, Stephanie, you get your second shot, and then after that, I'll probably wrap us up because of the hour.
Okay, thank you. Do you find a correlation between dystonia and GI issues? Like, can dystonia actually be internal? All of his discomfort is manifesting as GI stuff, and we feel like we've controlled for every variable that, and we can't figure it out. And so, I don't know. I'm just curious about that.
Yes, but I don't know if there's a direct link. I don't know, and the field does not know if there's a direct link. Often people that have dystonia also tend to have GI issues, because we tend to see both of those things in people that have more motor functional limitation across the board in CP, and also because if you have GI discomfort, that discomfort can trigger dystonia. So in someone that doesn't have GI issues, even if they have some dystonia, if they're comfortable all the time, you may not see it as much as someone that has that sort of discomfort trigger. But I don't know that one causes, I think GI discomfort can bring out dystonia. I don't know that dystonia can cause GI discomfort. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
And have you known CBD to be supportive at all?
Oh, great question. I think, I mean, I only have anecdote on that. I don't have hard data on that. I know of one family that did report benefit, and this was before CBD came out as in the FDA approved form in Epidiolex for seizures. I would say that most people have not reported direct benefit in my clinical practice, but I don't discourage people from trying it. I think if you've gone through other medication options, I think it's fine to add it on or to give it a shot. What I would say is that CBD, like any other medication, has interactions with medications that you may already be on. For example, like clobazam, which we often use for tone treatment, and Depakote, which many people are on for seizure treatment. So I would just make sure that if you're thinking about starting CBD, that you talk to your doctor about it and let them know, and also let them know about any dose changes. And it's something, I mean, something else for us to study for sure in the future, and something that people brought up uncertainties on as well.
Thank you so much.
All righty, great answers, great presentation, Bhooma. I want to say thanks to everyone for joining. I'm gonna, even though we're at the hour mark and there might be more questions, I'm gonna go celebrate my mother's 93rd birthday here. Yeah, and I need to get down to that. So thank you all for tuning in. Join MyCP if you haven't already, and participate in Bhooma's future studies. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.